Good afternoon. My name is Karel Poupaert. I'm Business Development Manager for Dell Enterprise Solutions at Big Data, and I will be your host for this webinar. Thank you for attending. I'm convinced that we've collected interesting content for you, but first of all, I would like to go over some housekeeping information. Voilà. All lines are on mute. However, if you have a question, feel free to use the questions and answers box. People from SYNNEX and Dell Technologies will monitor the box, and if possible, at the end of the presentation or the webinar, we will come back to answer the questions. If we do not have the time to answer all questions, we will definitely get back to you via email on the question you've raised in the questions and answers box. The presentation will be shared with all participants, and I have to say that this webinar will be recorded. This is an advantage because when you are interested, you will have the opportunity to have a second look at the presentation later on. So, having said this, let's kick off. Cybercrime is the greatest transfer of wealth in history. Currently, the annual cost for cybercrime is estimated at $6 trillion and expected to grow to $10 trillion in 2025. The cost of cybercrime is today already higher than the total global cost for all natural disasters. And if you are looking to find a new job, know that cybercrime is today already more profitable than drug crime. To be clear, I do not want to bring you on bad ideas. Those are worldwide large numbers, but know that closer to us, the issue also plays. In a 2021 research where 1,000 executives in EMEA were interviewed, Born found that 54% of them are concerned their organization's existing data protection measures may not be sufficient to cope with malware and ransomware threats. 70% agreed that employees working from home generate an increased exposure of data loss from cyber threats. And 69% are not very confident that all business critical data can be recovered or will be able to be recovered in the event of a destructive cyber attack. Maybe I did not have to tell you all this, as you reacted positively on our invitation for this webinar on cybersecurity, and more specific on how you can prepare and recover after a cyber attack. But at least the above numbers confirm that you are not alone with those concerns. And this is why Tech Data decided to organize this session, and why we invited two specialized organizations to contribute to this. First of all, next to myself, my name is Karel Poupaert, Business Development Manager for Tech Data. First of all, we've invited SYNNEX Consulting BV. They are an independent, high-quality cyber recovery consultant company who will talk about cyber attack risks and recovery challenges, and present tactics to become prepared for recovery after a cyber incident. And secondly, we've also invited Dell Technologies, a leading IT infrastructure supplier. They will outline how cyber recovery IT concepts and solutions can help to recover from data loss after a cyber attack. So, as a start, let me give you the floor to the people of SYNNEX. I will stop sharing. And Karim, I think you can take over.
I will take over, Karel. Thank you. Let me share my screen. If you're correct, you can see my presentation first slide. Can you confirm, Karel?
Hang on. Yep, got it.
Very good. Let Let me get to the first slide. There we go. We only have 20 minutes, so I will keep it short, but the good news is that the presentation will be shared, slides will be shared, so people can review later, and if there are any questions Carl already explained, you can put it in the chat box, or you can contact us later on. No problem at all. What you can take away from this slide is that in SYNNEX, both Karim and myself, we have a strong background in multinational companies in the delivery of disaster recovery solutions, and also specifically more cyber recovery or enterprise recovery, as we referred to it when we were still working for our original organizations. We exist now about, well, a bit more than half a year. We started our own company that is focusing on cyber recovery. And important to share is that we like to be customer trusted, and so on the side of the on the business, we want to be supplier independent. We want to take a risk-based approach, so think with the business on the risks that they identify. We like to be linked, we are linked to IT for IT service standards. As cyber recovery is a service, it needs to be set up and maintained as such. And we want to link to the NIST, National Institutes of Security and Technology. We link to NIST standards so that we don't forget anything. We have an holistic approach where everything is included. And what I will tell you more about is the SYNNEX structured cyber recovery delivery framework, which will come up in the next few slides. So what we try to deliver to our customers is organizational buy-in. People, not only IT, but also business, need to fully understand the risks that we are dealing with and the response they require. So what people will get is risk mitigation, risk-based approach, setup of an empowered recovery team that can deliver in an efficient and effective manner, which is what we like to refer to leads to recovery readiness. In summary, the challenge. So already mentioned cyber recovery readiness. What is it actually? And from a business perspective, it is the ability to restore a predefined set of critical business functions and processes after a cyber event. It's not IT, it's about recovering the business. But of course, as we all know, it starts with an increasing risk that we see. Carl already explained that the risk of being involved in a cyber attack with catastrophic business impact is growing all the time. But more important, or equally important, is that it's no longer a business, or recovery is not an item that IT needs to resolve. It's very important that business representation is also involved, as there's serious impact for the business. It's no longer like for disaster recovery, when there is a hot standby environment available, that business can wait for IT to come back and continue business operations. And there will be serious impact, and business simply has to deal with it. So the real question that organizations should ask themselves is, what is actually their ability to restore business operations, business and IT, efficiently, effectively after a ransomware attack? And the outcome of that question goes into the next slide. Very simple graph where the vertical line represents business impact, horizontal line represents time to recover. I think we all know the longer it takes to recover, the more business impact it will have. And as you can see in this graph, if it takes too long to recover, you will end up in the upper right corner where you get beyond recovery. Your business will go out of business, bankrupt. That's where companies don't want to be. So it's very important to make sure that at least recovery is possible, but clearly people want to be more in a healthy situation and become recovery ready. For some companies, the recoverability is very important. They may strive for recovery excellence, but we mostly focus on the area of recovery ready, cyber recovery readiness. How do you approach that? And what I'm going to explain a little bit more in the next slides is functionally what it is that needs to be in place functionally. I will talk a little bit more about organization required to make it happen, and also in a more structured approach to get things delivered. It starts with the business, of course. Important for organizations is to know what processes and functions are actually most important or very important to continue your business operations. Not everything is equally important. So when a business knows what is important to continue its business, they can make a selection, what we like to call a minimum viable company, of which what needs to be recovered first, so that business operations can continue, after which the rest that needs to be recovered can be completed as well. When people are aware of what exactly is the minimum viable company, that is when IT comes into play. Here we go. And that's where mapping will have to be made from those critical business functions and processes to the underlying and supporting applications. We find applications on-premise, can be in the cloud, public cloud, can also be SaaS, but it's important to know what applications they are. Not only the applications that people know from a business perspective, but also the applications that they again depend on. Very often applications depend on information that they get from other applications. Also needs to be clear to make sure that the underlying IT services can actually support the critical process. And of course, all applications, they all depend also on core IT infrastructure, an Active Directory, DNS, DHCP, key components that need to be there. It's like the road that cars drive on. First the road before you can actually drive. So this combination, these two components, are very important, as you can see them as the scope that needs to be recovered. Recovering the IT aspects, components in this picture will allow you to actually recover the operational processes that are so critical. But to be able to do that, you do need a cyber recovery service environment. And the cyber recovery service environment is different from a disaster recovery environment. What it needs is, first of all, you need a secure backup. That looks pretty similar, but very important is that you back up the components from the critical applications and infrastructure, that you need to actually rebuild your application. And just recovery is not enough. You need to be able to rebuild the application stack to fully recover the application layer. What you do, you put the secure backup in a secure vault, very key component here. And the secure vault, the word it says is already secure. It needs to be secured in a way that hackers, when they affect your operational environment, cannot get hold of data that sits in the secure vault. Secure vault is these days also an environment that several companies now start to explore further in whether or not they can analyze the behavior, the backup behavior in the secure vault, so that they can more or less start to predict the potential ransomware that it's on attack that is underway. From this point onwards, of course, when you have all your components in the secure vault that you need to rebuild, that is a point where you can say, I can rebuild. But it doesn't work, of course, if you do not have the parallel path properly implemented as well. Important here is that, of course, you need to be able to get the components from the secure vault, and you could have to put them in what we like to call a clean room environment, an isolated environment where people who know what they're doing from an application perspective can fully rebuild the application stack. This is also the environment where you find cyber defense specialists who can look for potential remaining malware, and those people can also help you to protect the application stack before you bring it back to production. The last component here is the safe release. And the safe release functionality is you don't want to have a recovered stack put back in production when it's not completely safe. So it's good to think about what you can do to prepare to put in an application environment, and first of all, protected with maybe microsegmentation or endpoint protection to prevent reinfection. But also, when you bring an application back into production, probably there's a backlog of transactions that needs to be operated. Many users want to use it immediately. So it would be good to think about how you can bring it back in a controlled way, limited set of users first to start using it, and then gradually open it up for operational use. At the bottom, you see, secure access. Secure access is very critical for the clean room environment for the specialists to build up the application, test the application before it gets back to production. But also recovery enablement. And recovery enablement is a specific supporting component that you need to recover. And you need to think about things like you need financial means. Funding needs to be there to suddenly buy stuff that you need. But also the normal procurement process takes too long. So you need a shortcut where you can buy immediately, maybe with a credit card with special approval from senior leaders. It can also be as simple as catering. People will probably have to work day and night or as long as they can. But of course they need to eat and maybe a place to stay like a hotel. But maybe also legal support. There can be all kinds of items that you can see as recovery enablement that is supporting the overall recoverability after a cyber attack. Now, the wrong way. Who are the people involved in the actual recovery? Well, after an attack, it starts with business continuity and in particular crisis management. As already mentioned, after a cyber attack, there's a real business interruption. So it's very important to keep your customers informed, but also the media. The media will automatically come and start talking about, presenting about things that have happened. There may be legal aspects that need attention or insurance. So there's all kinds of stuff from a business perspective that needs to be dealt with. It is typically crisis management, not so much IT yet, but of course, they will also bring in an empowered cyber recovery team. And an empowered cyber recovery team needs to be a compact team that can quickly collect information that is related to the recovery of the critical applications and infrastructure services. They are the ones that make decisions and they drive the actual IT recovery as well that you see at the bottom. But it's important that the actual IT recovery team doesn't get bothered by all kinds of people checking all the time for status. It's important that the IT recovery team can actually focus on the restoration of applications, build up the application stack as quickly as possible, and also in the right order as instructed by the empowered cyber recovery team. So here you see the functionality that needs to be delivered, but also organizationally, what we feel needs to be in place. And we like to call this the SYNNEX Cyber Recovery Framework. How do you get it all in place? And I fully realize that everybody on the call is probably drinking from a fire hose. There's a lot of information that comes in that I bring to the table. To get it all implemented, you need to take a structured approach. And this slide can potentially help a bit there. At the top, it starts with business buy-in. Business needs to understand the risks they are facing, and they have to be willing to invest to not only implement the solution, but also to maintain it. So a strategy needs to be defined and a planning to implement the strategy needs to follow. If we follow the clockwise, the circle, we talked about the minimum viable company. Business continuity needs to be involved to define the minimum viable company because precisely that will be recovered. It needs to be in line with the business need. It's about the empowered cyber recovery team and the right skilled resources. Up front, you need to know who the people are who are going to help you there. You need the cyber recovery playbooks and runbooks. Playbook is the overall orchestration that drives the overall restoration of all the application and IT services. The runbooks are specifically for the recovery of a specific application or infrastructure service. More to the left of the slide, we then find secure backup for rebuild. So we need that on a daily basis. It needs to be correct and accurate so that you have the right components every day available when you need them. You touch on operational excellence, and so governance and compliance. You not only want to be recovery ready after implementation, you want to maintain that. So you need to have the right checking processes to make sure that it stays in shape. And as you all know, the proof is in the pudding. Of course, testing for predictable outcomes is of key importance, that what is developed actually works. And the learnings that you take from there, you can bring them back into the planning cycle. And that is how you can continue to manage this. In the center, in the yin yang, you see we talked about cyber recovery services. Very key to have those. Without the services, you don't you can't actually recover at all. And the recovery enablement that we talked about. I will not go in detail again there. Now, a lot of information here. And what we, after talking to many parties, we keep seeing that it's that many companies are quite struggling to get started with all of this. And that is why in SYNNEX, we did set up a cyber recovery assessment overview, an approach that helps companies to get a better understanding of where they are on the maturity level. You need to read this slide from left to right. What we do in an assessment is, first of all, we collect some customer documentation that we can use to better understand the organizational environment, how it looks like at the moment. We talked about SYNNEX cyber recovery model that we will use as a reference model. We talked about NIST, information security framework, cybersecurity framework, designed for this kind of topics. And we talked about cyber recovery as a service, which will link to IT for IT service framework. Key ingredients that allow us to bring in a structured approach that can actually be maintained over time. The second column here is the kickoff execution. We kick off a meeting, we select certain people from the organization that we will interview. We have many questions that we can ask to better understand what's in place, what is missing. The data that comes out, we will put in an analysis phase. We developed a maturity ladder. You need to know where you want to be on the ladder and the gap that you have between where you are today and where you want to be. Most important from an assessment is the heat map. And so the functional components that we talked about, we rate them from the information we collected, and we make it quite easy to see where your strengths and weaknesses are with respect to cyber recovery readiness. And of course, we come with findings and conclusions that can lead to opportunities from all this information, and we will fold that in a cyber recovery assessment report that we deliver in the end. Important for the report is that, of course, the receiver of the report, it should help the receiver to take the next steps on the journey for cyber recovery readiness. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the approach that we recommend in SYNNEX. And this is the final slide. It shows a little bit what we can do for you to, well, the first part is about, we can easily give you a presentation of a day or so to go to all aspects that we briefly talked about, touched on in this presentation. We can do a light assessment. It's quicker with a simple interview of one person, maybe two, but you can only get some high-level recommendations from that. Or you can do a full assessment where we're really going to interview the people we think that need to be interviewed and collect quite a bit of data to thoroughly understand where you are and how to take things forward, which should lead to actionable recommendations that helps you to define next steps, next projects for implementation. And the last card is about consultancy, generic consultancy that we can deliver. We have quite a bit of experience in all aspects from business until technical implementation. So we think we can act as a pretty good sounding board to customers, but also suppliers of these services going forward. That, Carl, I think is where I give back the word to you, I believe.
Thank you very much, Kees. I think now we can, if you can stop sharing, we can pass on the presentation mode to Eric or Wilbert from Dell Technologies. Okay, I see your screen.
Yes. Okay.
And I can hear you. Let's go.
Let's go then. Just 1 minute on my screen. Let me. Yeah, I'm ready. So, good afternoon. My name is Erik Dralans. So don't be confused by the name that you see perhaps in the Zoom application. But I am indeed assisted by my colleague Wilbert Houwinkel. We are both, let's say, pre-sales engineers from the data protection business unit from Dell Technologies. And of course, traditionally, we look from that business unit to backup and recovery solutions, archiving, continuous data protection. But it's clear that these days customers expect as well from the data protection solution that it also covers, let's say, the requirements of recoverability following sophisticated attacks by all kinds of hackers that introduce ransomware. And as you know, and that was explained in the previous session, that these risks affect everybody and all businesses across all verticals, let's say. So nobody really escapes it, education, financial, healthcare, and name it. So important in building a solution that will enable you to recover pretty quickly, because that is an essential requirement, because like Kees mentioned, speed is then key as well to keep the viability of the company at the maximum. And we structure all these approaches typically in a framework. What we do with our recovery solution that we will highlight to you is that we put it into the perspective of the NIST cybersecurity framework. That is a framework that tells you, it's a blueprint that tells you what to do and where you can look at the different levels. It is free of charge, let's say. So I would certainly recommend that you have a look to that cybersecurity framework. There is the correct or the full link, let's say, in the next slide. Now, within that framework, there are several functions defined, which are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Now, of course, the cyber recovery solution from Dell Technologies is, let's say, located in the last part, recovery. But you will see that our solution also can contribute to the functions of protection and detection. So there is a multiple, let's say, use case for the solution that we can implement for you. And that is not unimportant, because finally, look at what people do to protect themselves. They look to anti-ransomware or antivirus software components, firewalls, intrusion detection, and so on. But it is clear that today all these, let's say, components or aspects do not bring sufficient protection altogether. So any component that can contribute to that protection and detection function are certainly welcome. I think what is also clear to stress after the presentation from Kees is that addressing this kind of approach is a whole project, and that is not only bringing a lot of extra work to an organization, it brings also new, let's say, infrastructure and software to the table that needs to be managed. And that's also important to say then that bringing a cybersecurity framework into production is an iterative process. You don't stop when it is finished. You finished and you implement it, and then you start over again with the identify, and you reassess your environment. And so you can, let's say, keep the solution up to date, but also incorporate, let's say, changes like new applications, new components, and so on in the equation. So cyber resiliency is a complete strategy, is a complete approach, while cyber recovery is, let's say, one component or one piece in that equation, and it brings a solution from the data protection perspective, where we want to isolate the mission critical data. So it is also important previously to make, like Kees mentioned, the distinction between what is mission critical, what is business critical. You will see that you will have to make some kind of decision or choices between the data and applications that you want to protect at most, in order to define or to start up the minimal viable company, like it was mentioned. What you see is that later on, that what we protect in this solution will indeed prevail, and the objectives from typical security policy or security approach, that is to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data at all times. Also important is indeed, again, to stress the difference between disaster recovery and cyber recovery. So we often have customers that ask us, well, we have a disaster recovery in place. So we replicate all data to another site. We have full redundancy at all infrastructure levels and application levels. But it is clear that in a completely interconnected world, and typically in disaster recovery solutions, the data centers or the different locations are interconnected, that this will not provide you sufficient, let's say, security against cyber threats. Because of that interconnectivity, the threat is going to spread immediately everywhere, and then plays, of course, the knowledge of all those bad guys. They know very well what the applications are, what the network protocols are that are used, and so on. And for that reason, consider cyber recovery really as a complementary solution to be put in place next to disaster recovery. Of course, that has as well, let's say, implications on, let's say, budget assignments to put that in place. And then sometimes customers ask us, yes, but maybe we need to put disaster recovery at a lower priority level against cyber recovery. But that, again, some kind of, let's say, exercise that needs to be done within that framework, where you do risk assessment and you look at what are the priorities, what do I want to spend my money on, and which is most important for me to protect. Okay. So one important thing was, the attack surface. Kees mentioned it also, that, it was Karel, sorry, that mentioned in his introduction that today, specifically last 2 years, with people working from home more than ever, that introduces new ways where, let's say, malware can come into the company. People working from home, they do surf sometimes to other websites. They do sometimes also use their private email, mailbox, and so on. And then that means more open doors that can be, let's say, exploited by the bad guys. And once they get in, they go for, let's say, an exploration of the environment, and they will address or attack, let's say, mission critical functions like Active Directory, your databases, your applications. They will also be able to exploit network vulnerabilities and use, like, for example, NFS and CIFS protocols to go from one storage device to another one. And precisely that brings as well the traditional backup environment at risk, which means that if you write your data, for example, today to classic storage devices, well, NFS is a very well-known protocol, and that brings a lot of vulnerability. So typically what we see is that analysts like Gartner and IDC recommend you to put, let's say, the backup data on well-dedicated
Eric?
call a vault, just to isolate everything. And that means that if you look at what are the key requirements when you want the 3 I's, like I call it, which is isolation, and that is really up to complete physical isolation of that environment to protect it at all times, or let's say most times, from the bad guys. Of course, immutability, where you want to avoid that data are lost and deleted or modified. By the way, when we talk about those risks, that does not mean always that these come with by the bad guys. Human error is also one important factor which is brought by insiders, let's say, and they can also accidentally, let's say, bring risk to the viability, or let's say the immutability of the data. Another aspect is intelligence, and as you will see later in the presentation, we also want to emphasize this, because a lot of competitors and a lot of players in this market, they do bring isolation and immutability, sometimes, of course, with different, let's say, strategies or different techniques. But what they mainly lack often is intelligence. That is, you have those data in your vault that you will rely on in case you are completely entering into an encrypted environment by those ransomware. Well, even in that isolated environment, you want to be sure that there is no sleepware available. And I will explain that later on in the presentation. And of course, the most important thing perhaps is when you are attacked, you want to recover. And then speed is key. And one of the aspects to speed up the recovery after you are hit is indeed to know which is my last good copy that I can use. Isolation is also brought, let's say, by a traditional backup to tape. But just imagine that if you would like to recover from tape, you don't know what copy you need to restore. And perhaps you will try to restore with the last backup from yesterday, but then see that it is not clean, and you go back further in time to find the last good copy. But that is a very long process, and that costs time. That brings your company more at risk when that time increases. And so also there we will explain how we can speed up that recovery. Now, there are some key components in our solution. The first one is let's say, a target for the data to land on. And that is a Poupaert data domain product that we have. It is available as a physical appliance, but it can also be installed as a virtual appliance, which means that it could also, for example, be deployed in cloud environments, which also means, by the way, that the build of a vault to host your critical data could also be set in a cloud environment, so public cloud provider. The Poupaert data domain, that is a technology that continues to evolve the last 20 years. So it's going, let's say, it introduces always the new technologies and new security features. What you need to remember is that it is a hardened system. So we strip off all the things that are not needed at the operating system level. We close all the doors and let's say network connectivity options that are not required. We also apply let's say zero trust principles. And for example, that means that to be able to make, let's say, fundamental changes to the data domain system, like changing time clock, like changing passwords, like changing configurations, or like resetting the system, we can make sure that this cannot be done by one single person, like the administrator, but that you can define a security administrator, and that would require then 4 hands or to people, let's say, to be able to do these fundamental changes to the system. And the hardening of the system is, of course, one element as well to bring the first layer of protection and to protect yourself against the insider threats that could be like people that are blackmailed from within the company or that are frustrated for some reason. Now we come back, that's the target where we will land the data on. I will later on explain how these components will be used in the cyber recovery solution. The other key component is a software component called Cybersense. And that's the component that brings the intelligence in the solution. It is a software that will analyze all the data that lands in the vault. And as you will see, the analysis is very deep. It goes up to the full content that is analyzed. We look at all types of changes. As you can read on the slide, there are more than 100 statistics that are, let's say, verified in each backup set that enters into the vault. We make then comparisons with the previous backup sets, and we detect, let's say, sudden and concerning changes within or between those backup sets, like sudden deletes from files or sudden big increases on files and so on. But I come back on that aspect later on again with the next slide. So how would we build then that cyber recovery solution, so that cyber recovery vault? You have in your data center your production environment in a, let's say, traditional way, but of course you have as a target for the backup data, the data domain technology. And then what you can see here on the slide is that the data are represented by those little squares, blue and green. And you will make that selection previously, like we mentioned. And so you only select, in this case, the green little blocks that represent your mission critical data that are really most important to start up after an attack, which is your minimal viable company. Now, these data can be replicated by the data domain technology to the cyber recovery vault. The setup in this case is in such a way that the infrastructure that is available in the cyber recovery vault is totally invisible from the production side. There is only a single physical connection between, let's say, the data domain in the production side, and a data domain that will be in the vault. And that connection is coming up once a day, for example, or depending on the frequency that is defined, just to enable synchronization of those data. When the data are synchronized, the door closes, and that's the air gap, that's the isolation that we provide. And then what you will do is, of course, lock those data. And that's the aspect of immutability. You make a copy of those data in the vault and you lock it. You lock it by using timestamps and technology. And there again, remember what I mentioned, that you cannot tamper or play with the system clock from that device just to go beyond the security brought by that immutability. So once you have those, let's say, blocked or copies and immutable copies, you can, of course, rely on those when you would be hit on the production side to recover. Now, recovery, again, like Kees mentioned, you can address that in different ways. Typically, depending on the size of the environment and the budgets available, you might foresee in that same vault environment, which is complete physical separate room, some extra compute nodes. And that compute node is, let's say, for the validation and the cleaning of the data that you want to restore. It is as well in the vault that we will bring the intelligence, and that's the aspect analysis. So Cybersense, the software that we mentioned, will do the full content analysis of the data that lands systematically within the cyber vault. We of course define a certain retention for those data in the vault, depending on, let's say, a customer that can be weeks or sometimes exceptionally months. That Cybersense does all that intelligence, and because of the reporting and the forensics analysis that are permitted by Cybersense, we will be able very quickly to define that, let's say, that last known good copy that needs to be restored. And recovery is then, let's say, pretty fast compared to traditional ways. Recovery can be done in several ways. You could, let's say, do the recovery on compute nodes that are available in the Cyber Recovery Vault, after which you move those compute nodes, for example, to the data center. But you can also just reverse replication between data domain devices and bring the clean data back in the production site in that way. So how does Cybersense work? I briefly touched it already in one of the previous slides. So of course we index everything, and with all the data sets that come in daily, we do the full analysis every time. And then that permits us to define a baseline. And that baseline will then also be compared with the subsequent analysis sessions that happen with the incoming data. We look at a lot of statistics. So the things that we look at are the file names, the file extensions, the file sizes, which are traditional methods, let's say, to look at changes. But that's not enough. Just imagine that you would have a database file with its particular extension. Well, as long as you are not going to look within the file, it could be that it goes unnoticed that that file suddenly is, let's say, encrypted or partially encrypted, because one of or some of those smart ransomwares, what they do is when they start to encrypt the data, they don't do it all at once, but they do it by little chunks of 8K, 16K. And traditional detection methods do not see that at once. So with Cybersense, we can look within the file and we see that there is a change of entropy, a change of how the data are, let's say, structured and organized within that file. And that allows us, considering the known attack vectors, to detect when ransomware is still there, maybe not fully active, but already present, and doing its surveillance work and detection work before going into activity. And that, let's say, brings me to the message that I brought earlier, which is that the solution that we provide does not only play in the part of recovery, but because we have another way to detect the presence of ransomware, we will also play with this solution in the aspect of protection and detection. And that's, of course, key. The faster you can detect something suspect within the organization or within the environment, the better you are, and the faster also that you can, let's say, address it and do or take the right response to mitigate it. So again, many competitors, they only do analysis, let's say, on the file metadata, while we, with Cybersense, we can look within the data. To do that, we are not limited only to the data protection software from Dell Technologies. We are also open with the technologies to analyze data that are landing in the Cyber Recovery Vault on that data domain, but data sent by other backup softwares. So in that respect, there is an open architecture available. But competitors sometimes only look to metadata and it stops. And in best case, what they do is they send data to the cloud, which takes again more time. And then again, also they do some additional, let's say, analysis over there. So with this said, I think briefly within the time limited time that we have, what we wanted to highlight is we bring isolation with the air gap when we set up the replication between the data domain devices. We open and we lock the door. We bring the immutability by blocking the accidental or voluntarily deletion or modification of the data that land in the vault. We bring the intelligence by the Cybersense software that does the full context analysis. And of course, we bring the ability to do a recovery very fast by being able to identify that last good copy. Now, I said, just to bring that to your attention again, so the minimal viable company needs to be defined, as Kees also mentioned. That means you will likely not bring all the data, 100% of your data into the vault, but you look to what is, let's say, the most important things, the customer-facing applications, maybe the billing application and so on, production software that needs to be started up again as fast as possible. And so usually, as you can see, that is 20%, 30% of the data, sometimes up to 50%, but it's definitely analysis that needs to be done up front to define what you will bring into the vault. And it's not only about data, it's also, let's say, other components that are very important to bring up, let's say, the company up and running again. And that is like, if you would have, just to give you an example, homemade software, the source code of the software is very important. So you want to keep a golden copy of that source code within the vault, because the last thing you would like to have is that all, let's say, copies of that source code would be encrypted at the same time by the ransomware. We also think about a copy of Active Directory settings, but also configurations that are present on networking components, on storage devices, or other, let's say, important devices that are in an organization and that needs to have the code or the typical configurations preserved. All these things can be put as well within that vault and enable, of course, the speeded up recovery. Again, it's fine to have those copies, but like also Kees mentioned earlier, it is still essential to have a plan, to have let's say, run books that enable you to do the response in a fast way, in the right order, with the right people at that point in time when these things would happen. So to conclude, I would say you can address it in different ways. A first good thing is, of course, to make sure that you use the correct target where you send your information to, and avoid the use of the vulnerable networking protocols. Also bring a device that brings you already the immutability and that is hardened with the elevated security credentials. That will also help at that point in time to already increase protection from insiders. And normally speaking, without having, let's say, to make concessions about the software or the backup software that you would use. Now, in all these things is automation, let's say, key. And we cannot deny that the implementation of our own backup softwares with this data domain technology will bring for you the best, let's say, automation principles to the table. And then the best solution, of course, is the automated air gap with that dedicated physical environment where you keep the copies of the mission critical data. Now, that's a lot. That might be scary, but let's say you can go to this final solution in different steps and just start with, let's say, implementing as a good first step the use of data domain technology, to protect the data, and then gradually extend and increase the solution set. Also, to bear in mind that when you implement this type of solution, you do not necessarily have to put everything in-house, in the way that, in the sense that there are big international service providers, but also local service providers that provide this vault as a service to customers that are not willing to build their own vault, or that for budgetary reasons, or let's say managerial reasons, lack of let's say good people, can or want to rely on those service providers. So that's a conclusion, let's say. I hope that that gave you some good idea of what the solution includes. And I think one important message that we always bring is that everybody needs a vault, stressing that nobody is free to be attacked or by those bad guys out there increasingly. So that's to end my piece. Karel?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eric. If you would like to stop sharing.
I will do that.
In the meantime, we had a question in the questions and answers box, but this has been answered by. Please let us know if you would like to have more information. Otherwise, as a takeaway for this webinar, we would like to point to a cyber resilience health check available online. This is developed by Enterprise Strategy Group, maybe better known as ESG, in charge of Dell Technologies, VMware, and Intel. This exercise, so this assessment, will allow companies to assess how prepared they are in processes and technology in order to protect against and recover from cyber attacks. As a result of this assessment, actionable recommendations will be proposed based on the information provided. This is definitely not comparable to the extended services that Readiness explained, but this could be a very good start to have an initial assessment on an IT environment. And the link for or to this assessment will be included in the presentation, so you will be able to find it there. In fact, you have a short key below visible already.
Yeah, hey, Karel.
Sorry?
I have a question. Just a question, because I saw the question that, in the chat. So SYNNEX can also help partners. So does SYNNEX, for example, if a partner is willing to speak with his customers about the cyber, about our solution from Dell EMC, but they struggle a bit with some consultancy, is SYNNEX also good for partners?
Yes, SYNNEX, yes. So we agreed on this. So SYNNEX is a Dutch company specialized in cyber recovery, cyber strategy. And yes, if there are IT integrators who do not have this competence in-house, let me put it this way, and are looking for a partner to team with, this is definitely something which can be arranged. Do not hesitate to contact me. Here you can see my email address for those who do not know me, and I can definitely bring you in contact with the people of Dell or SYNNEX if needed. Okay. This finalizes our webinar for today. I hope you found it useful. Please do not hesitate to contact me in case you would like to receive more information or to get in touch with one of the speakers. I hereby also would like to thank those companies, so the speakers, for their participation on the webinar. And also, of course, thank you very much for attending this webinar. Stay cyber safe. Thank you.